OpenAir. What is the point? In OpenAir, the scripting engine is available to allow you to do data validation and manipulation behind the scenes without having to use the interface. You will be able to do notifications. You'll be able to do approval processes based on events, based on data triggers that you can find in the application. The scripting engine uses standard JavaScript with OpenAir-specific libraries. We'll talk about some of those libraries here in just a minute to execute commands. But unlike a lot of web-based scripting, you can't use it to manipulate the interface. The interface is what it is, and even though JavaScript is often used to add buttons, remove text, add drop-down fields, etc., in OpenAir, it's not an option. So it is not to be used to alter the OpenAir user interface. It simply can't. All right, so what does it do? Well, there's two types of scripts primarily that you use in OpenAir. First one is called a form script. And what triggers execution of a form script is someone saving or submitting or approving a form, an actual form in OpenAir. It's primarily useful for data validation, but can be used for some limited data manipulation in the database behind the scenes. And we'll explain what limited means here in just a minute. There are also scheduled scripts that run on, ironically, a set schedule. They can be run as frequent as once every 5 minutes, though if you're working with us on these, we usually will not recommend running them that often for various reasons depending on what the script is actually doing. They're useful for data manipulation adjustments that you need to make in the data. But if you're trying to do them in a sandbox, you'll need to contact NetSuite support, OpenAir support, because by default, scheduled scripts simply will not run in a sandbox. There's a blocker in place that OpenAir support has to remove for a scheduled script to function in a sandbox. They're happy to do it. It just takes a support ticket to ask them to allow scheduled scripts to run in the sandbox, but if you don't do that, then you'll start your scripts and you'll sit there wondering why it's not doing anything. So let's talk about the concept of scripting governance for a minute before we go too further into this. This is why we say that a form script can only do limited data manipulation. Because OpenAir places limitation on the number of transactions and the time and the number of emails that a script can execute or produce. Each command that you do in the OpenAir specific JavaScript libraries takes a certain number of what they call units. For example, if you're reading a value from a form, that just takes 1 unit. That's easy to do. If you're writing an error message to the log, that's not too bad either, 4 units. If you're reading values from the database, you've got a 20-unit payment up front, and then 10 units for every record that you read. So that's a bit more heavy on the unit usage. The one that's actually worse than that is writing data to the database, which takes actually twice as much as reading. So something to be aware of as you look at your governance within OpenAir. Now, what are the limitations? Well, a form script only has 5 seconds to run. So if you're trying to do anything that's going to require any kind of significant data manipulation, a form script is going to time out before it's going to be able to accomplish it. It allows you to use 1,000 units of those measures that we just discussed in the governance, which may seem like a lot. It really is not. There's not a whole lot you can do with 1,000 units. You can read a few records, maybe write 1 or 2. That's about it. And then if you're sending emails from a form script, you're limited to 3 emails with 1 line of a subject and 1,000 characters in the email itself. With a script, and this is why a form script is largely useful for data validation, because all you're doing with the form script most of the time is saying, check the value of this field on the form. Does it match this validation setup? Is it between this value and this value? Or if the user is in this department, is it okay for them to put this kind of data in that field, or these kinds of things? A lot of it is just data validation. Scheduled scripts have an hour-long runtime as opposed to 5 seconds. They can use 1 million units instead of 1,000, and they can send 100 emails at once during a script run. Now that seems much more reasonable, and that you can do a lot more with a scheduled script, which is in fact obviously true. You can do a lot of deep data manipulation with scheduled scripts. However, we hit these limitations all the time. We have had clients that have had to break out their scripts into 2 or sometimes more than 2, that the script is basically doing the same thing, but they've had to create multiple instances of it because each run can only do so much. And so they've got a few of them running at a time, all doing the same thing. It's kind of gaming the system a little bit, if you will. Interestingly enough, we've almost never seen scheduled scripts affect a system's performance, no matter how often they're running. It's really rare that these actually interfere with what the other users are experiencing in OpenAir. So if that is a concern that you have, chances are you don't need to worry about it. I think I've probably seen that be a factor of 1 or maybe 2% of the time we've rolled out scheduled scripts, only in a very, very intense data manipulation. So the Scripting Center in OpenAir was introduced a few years ago. It's been enhanced every release since. Basically what it's there for is to act as a container around your script code. So you're not writing code outside of OpenAir and running it outside of OpenAir like you would through the API. You're writing JavaScript directly inside a form inside of OpenAir. They put a wrapper around it to try to keep any of that code from doing any damage to the data integrity and keeping a lid on the system performance issues. So it's really a nice way to implement this scripting engine. It's very similar to what you've seen in other software as a service type applications. It provides some functions within the Scripting Center to help build your scripts a little quicker. It still requires JavaScript knowledge. It's not going to build scripts for you. You still need to be able to enter the JavaScript that you're going to need, but it does give you some tips and tricks and tools to help you get these done in a faster manner. The Scripting Center has we'll call it built-in, even though it's manually executed, workflow that allows development and development testing to occur in OpenAir without affecting the system except for the developer or the test user. So when you first start a script, as you can see on the left, it starts out as just an inactive wrapper. There's nothing in there. Once you have something written, it'll go into this testing mode that you see in the blue text box on the left. What that means is that code only impacts one user, and it is the user that you identify in the script center that is going to be the tester. And so you can have that code in there, and your user can test it, and it won't even execute for anybody else. So that helps if you're making changes, if you're trying to do something for the first time, you've already built it in a sandbox, and you're trying to test it in production after you've recently moved it. Or if you don't have a sandbox instance, this is a good way to get that code tested without impacting anyone else in your organization. Once you feel that has successfully been tested, you can deploy it. It moves it to an active stage in the green. And then if you still need to make changes to it, you can revise it, and the active code will affect everyone, and the changes you're making will again only impact your test user. So when it is in that orange active revising stage, it's still functional for everybody in your organization as of the last release that was deployed, but the changes that you've made can be tested by one person, one user that you've identified. So that's how the workflow functions in the Scripting Center. Basically, it can exist in your production environment without impacting anybody except for your tester. This is a snapshot of what the Scripting Center looks like. You can see the form and scheduled links at the top. We'll talk about libraries and parameters and solutions a little bit here toward the end of this presentation. On the left, you can see some of these helpers that I mentioned earlier. And we'll go through what these do here briefly in the next slides. But that's kind of a snapshot of what it looks like. You have your code in the large window in the bottom right or the right side of the screen, and you have all these helpers on the left. Here are the functions that the Scripting Center gives you, the items that we saw on the left of the screen. The Scripting Studio allows you to identify your test owner, what function in the code should be the kickoff function, what libraries are you calling, a few other things. Note that the script owner has to have the view and permission, so it has to be in their filter set. They have to have the right role to be able for this script to take effect. So if you're building a script for someone and it requires that they be able to do something that their role does not allow, the script's going to throw an error message saying, sorry, you can't do this. So you got to take that into account as you're building and designing these. The SOAP Explorer, if you're familiar with SOAP, it's basically a protocol for building web service requests. What this does, however, in OpenAir, it shows you all of the tables that you can manipulate and all of the fields in each table. This is extraordinarily handy. Basically what it will do is it's a drop-down of, I don't know the exact number, somewhere around 150 tables, project table and user table, invoices, bookings, you name it, it's probably there. And as you select that table, then there's a field, a text area right below it that will give you all of the fields that are in that particular table. So if you selected user table, then you would see the name, the name field, the nickname field, few address fields, every field that is available on a user record. So if you're not sure what the name of the field is or the name of the table is and you're trying to put it into your code, you can look it up right there within the Scripting Center. You don't have to go to Data Dictionary or any other tool. And one word on that, if you do decide to go to the Data Dictionary, if you're familiar with OpenAir's Data Dictionary, you'll find that the names of the tables and the fields don't match what the Scripting Center is looking for. Usually it's a matter of one having an underscore and the other one not. So you're going to find that if you do use any other source but this SOAP Explorer to find the names of fields and tables, you're going to get errors in your code because the names are not what the Scripting Center is expecting. There's a function explorer that displays all of the OpenAir specific JavaScript functions. I'll show you those libraries here in an upcoming slide. There are script parameters. This basically allows you to say, I want there to be a value that the script uses, but if somebody needs to change that value, I don't want them to have to change the code. So what we do typically with these is we use them for email addresses. So if you set up a notification in a script, you want it to go to this email address. We're not going to hard code the email address into the code. We're going to put it in one of these parameters, and then anyone with access can go in and change that. If the person moves to a different department, you need this to go to somebody else, they can go in and change that email address. They're not touching any of the code, so there's no need to retest. Makes their auditors happy, and they can do that. Custom fields shows a list of all the custom fields and the tables that they are in case you need to look those up by their actual display names. Those are also in the SOAP Explorer, but they're not in there by their display names. They're in there by their behind-the-scenes names, which on occasion can be kind of cryptic. So this custom fields area lets you look them up by the names you actually see in OpenAir. The terminology displays terminology specific to your instance. So if you've called projects something else, a lot of our legal clients will rename them to matters, for example. Then this terminology area will say, here's what you call this particular item so that you can get the name correct in your code. And then the form schema is there only on form scripts, and it shows you all the fields that are on that form and what their behind-the-scenes names are so that you can use those in your script code as well. All very useful features. The only one that I have not gotten much value out of personally is the terminology. usually because if someone has changed that, I'm already aware of it and I don't need to look it up. And I think you'll find that'll be the case for you too. You know what your terminology for your individual company is. It's going to be rare when you'll have to look it up, I expect. These are the OpenAir specific JavaScript libraries. There are functions under each of these different libraries that do different things. Context is there to provide just system information. You can look up how many units you've used in the middle of a script. You can look up how long the script is run so you can see how efficient your script is functioning, if you're getting close to the governance limits, etc. The form library allows you to retrieve data from a saved or a submitted form directly off the form itself without hitting the database. The meta library is used strictly for logging and alerts. The NS connector is a JavaScript library that allows you to kick off a NetSuite integration if you have one set up in your instance. You can't use this to set one up. You can't use this to alter it. All you can do is say run the integration. That's it. Now that can be pretty useful in certain circumstances if you want to run the instance on demand based on a certain event. But that is all that connector will allow you to do, at least as of the latest release, is just run that integration after it's already been configured. The record library allows you to set up objects in JavaScript that mimic OpenAir's database definitions. You will use this extensively if you build scripts. The report library is only for use with the OpenAir Business Intelligence connector. If you don't have the Business Intelligence connector, I don't even think you will see this library in your scripting center. And all it's really used to do is identify metadata associated with reports that you publish with the Business Intelligence connector. So you can see the names of the reports you published, when they were published, how much space they take up, that kind of thing. You cannot access the data within those reports. It's only metadata about the reports themselves. And then the Wasapi JavaScript library, Web Services API. This is the other one you'll use all the time because this is what allows you to hit the database. If you need to do a read, if you need to do a modify to the data, if you're going to delete data, this is the library that you use to do it. Anything that is a web service that's hitting that database directly is going to be in that area. So a quick form script example. This particular form script was designed to catch negative time values. Somebody's entering time into their timesheet, and for whatever reason they put in negative hours. This particular client did not want that to be an option. And so this technically 7-line script, I guess, was written to prevent that from happening. The way that it was built is we clicked on the green plus in the scripting center on the left, and we selected a time entry form script deployment. And at that point, we were able to put in this code that if you're familiar with JavaScript, you probably can make sense of it. Basically, it's saying create a variable called total and get the value of the form field called total from the time entry, which is the hours in this case. At that point, it spits a record out to the log file in OpenAir saying, here's what the total was that I read. That's really mostly for debugging purposes, so you can see, make sure that it's reading what you expected it to. And then if the total is less than 0, obviously a negative amount, then we throw an error. Say, hey, nope, you can't do that. That value must be positive. And that's the entire point of this particular script. It's just a really quick example to give the idea of some of the simpler things you can do. So scheduled script examples, we don't have time on a webinar to go into these in any real detail. These can be really complex. Sometimes they're not too bad. On other occasions, they can be quite extensive. The smallest ones I've seen have been in the 80 to 100 lines of code range, which it really isn't that much, considering that it takes 7 lines, 10 or 12 lines actually to just read records out of the database. But just to give you an idea of some of the things you can do with it. And then as far as some of the most complicated ones, well over 1,000 lines of code that we've written for more complicated purposes. Some of the scheduled scripts that we've built include, and these are probably more the simpler variety, summing the total of planned or booked hours on all tasks for the project and moving that total to the budget hours field on the project. So this was an instance for a client that wanted to keep the budget consistent with what they had in their booked hours or their planned hours. They wanted that budget hours field to always mimic that. This can be really useful for percent complete revenue recognition, where you're using budget hours as the denominator of your percent complete calculation. It's a way to be able to use booked hours without having to use the incurred versus forecast revenue recognition process. This one is one of the more complex ones we've done, and I'd be willing to bet, I haven't looked to see who actually is on the phone right now. I'm willing to bet at least one of you has this in your implementation because we've put this in a number of instances. And what this does is it's a script that takes a fixed fee revenue transaction, and if you've used those, you're aware that these are one value associated with one person or no people, depending on how you've got it configured. And it takes that fixed fee and divvies it up amongst the users that contributed to it. So you can do it on a time basis. There's a number of different ways you can do it. The most common is this is the fixed fee for the month or for this phase of the project, and we go in and the script will find out who worked on the project during that month or on that phase of the project, and it will split that fixed fee amongst them based on either their hours or their hours times a rate, maybe a cost or a projected bill rate, so that they can see what that individual's contribution to revenue was for that fixed fee. And again, we've got this out there. A number of clients have this in place. Copying a field on a project's properties to every charge associated with that project. So in this case, there are a number of fields that you can get on a charge right through a billing rule, such as a service or a task type or things like that. But if you have a custom field you want on all of your charges, you can't do that through the billing rule. It's not going to pass on custom fields. So this was a client who had that circumstance where they wanted to see a project-specific field on all of the charges associated with that project. And so we put actually a pretty simple script in that looks for new charges, and anytime it sees one, it updates that charge with this field from that charges project. And then last one here, updating a custom project property with dates from specific tasks or milestones on the project. So this, again, is a pretty common one. It comes in a whole lot of different flavors because everybody wants something a little bit different. But the example here is there's a milestone on the project that's called prototype complete, and what we did is when that milestone was hit, we copied that date that it was hit onto a prototype complete custom field on the project. And the benefit of that is that now you have all that information right on the project itself. You don't have to open up tasks to figure out what dates were hit when. You can use that in a status report type situation or metrics directly on the project properties form itself. Again, I think this one's been pretty useful. It's been out there with a number of clients. Okay, we are running a little low on time, but I don't want to short this, so I will probably be going over time by 5 minutes or so, just so you're aware. Best practices in scripting. There's a few references here that I strongly recommend. The first one is OpenAir Scripting Guide. That's far and away the most useful piece. It's got lots of examples. It gives you details on every function that you can use in the scripts. All of those NSOA libraries are described in detail. It's a very good reference. And I'll just throw this out there. When I first started using OpenAir 15 or so years ago, we were a very small company, and they had not had the opportunity to invest a lot in their documentation, and there just wasn't a lot there. Over the years, that has become a real strong point of this organization. Their guides are really useful, very detailed. At least that's my opinion. The data dictionary can be found at that location. Again, I'd be very cautious using this because the field names will not match what the script is looking for. or at least they have the potential of not matching. But at least will give you an understanding of how tables can interact with one another. And then the last one with the link here is a JavaScript reference site. I'm not trying to endorse any specific JavaScript reference site. There are a number of them out there. This has been the most useful for me. It's formatted in a way that is similar to the way that I think and the way I would expect information to be organized. So that's the one that I use, but there are many of them out there. The last item here is the SOAP Explorer and the Functions Explorer in the Scripting Center, which we've already discussed. Those are very useful tools as well. Scripting logs. With the OpenAir scripting engine, you can add log lines anywhere within the code that you want to track something. So what we typically recommend is a few things. When you do a read request, you're trying to read data from OpenAir, log the number of records you read. And then when you go back and look in your log file, you can say, that read 15 records. I was expecting something closer to 50 or 60. I wonder if there's a problem here. And you can go and look at your criteria and see if that's an issue. It's a very simple way to detect what can be pretty tricky issues. Evaluate the results of any add or modify. I'll even add delete to that. And write the successes or failures of those web services to your log. These fail all the time for reasons that you can't even guess when you're writing the script. Unfortunately, there's a downside to the logs on this. They will only write a code that describes the error, not anything in text that tells you what the error is. So you have to look up the code for them to make any sense. And the codes are only found in the SOAP and XML API guides provided by OpenAir. So just be aware of that. If you need to look up a code, that's where you find them. And there are lots of them. You can get codes for anything from a user doesn't have access to that function or feature. I can't find the record that you've specified you're looking for. You can't update this time sheet because it's already approved or it's already exported or something like that. There's logs or codes for all of those different kinds of errors. Keep track of your governance limits. I can't stress this enough. This becomes a problem far more often than you'd think. The governance limitations are not high. As much as they may seem, an hour of runtime and 1 million units, that seems like a lot, you will run into them often. It causes a bit of trouble. You got to be very cautious about how you develop your code and how you design it to avoid running into these limitations. There's 6 different kinds of logs that you can spit out, and they're all listed here. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into too much detail on what these are, but they're basically designed so that you can set the script to display error logs of one of these types and above. So what I do in my coding is when I'm really trying to get down to the nitty-gritty and figure out exactly what the script is doing on a line-by-line or phase-by-phase, function-by-function level, I'll use that trace level in my logs so that it spits out a lot of information. And then when I put it into production, I don't have to go in and remove all of this so that it doesn't spit out tons of data into my log that it's just going to take up space. I can tell the script, hey, now that I'm in production, I've tested it, I'm happy with it, only put in the logs that are of type warning or above. And so anything I put in that info, debug, or trace into my code doesn't show up in the log file anymore and doesn't clutter things up, doesn't take up space. So these are really useful ways of helping the developer and helping the tester see what they need to see without drawing huge amounts of clutter into your logs once you move them into production. In summary, OpenAir scripting can introduce logic specific to your business processes that OpenAir, out of the box does not handle or doesn't handle the way you would like it to. It can increase your data accuracy, and by this we mean lots and lots of validations. You can check to see if things are over a certain amount. We've actually put things. One of the bigger, one of the most common feedback items we get from people using OpenAir is that they would like it to not allow people to put in time more than they are booked to a task or a project, or more than they are assigned to a task or project. And if you've used OpenAir, for any length of time, you know that there's no restriction at all in terms of the amount of time somebody can put in. If they're assigned to the task, or if they're booked to the task, or if you have it configured, they can just keep putting in time until that task is closed. So we've built scripts that will do lots of different things with this. Sometimes it'll detect it and send an email to somebody when that happens. Sometimes it will simply prevent them from adding it. Sometimes it will move it to a non-billable task if it's over a certain threshold. There's a number of different things you can do with this scripting engine that are really useful. Careful design of solutions is required to meet those governance limits. I think I've probably hammered on that enough. Follow these best practices. Connect with each other to share experiences and ideas. Post things to the LinkedIn users, the OpenAir user group. You can send questions into our support team, any of this. Don't be afraid of the scripting engine. There's very little you can do that's going to be irreparable and cause you significant heartache. In fact, I don't think there's anything you can do that's irreparable. Just about anything can be rolled back. So don't let it scare you. If you have a need, go ahead and give it a shot, or contact us. We'll help you give it a shot. We can teach you how to use it. We can build scripts for you, whatever you'd like